The Hawkins Farm in northeastern Indiana has been a working family farm since 1957. Today, Jeff Hawkins and his son Zach continue the tradition.
So this is a 99-acre farm in Wabash County, Indiana, and my dad and I farm together.
Jeff and Zach raise hogs, cattle, vegetables, and poultry. They sell primarily to families and restaurants in the area. And in the summer, Friday is brick oven pizza night.
We embody what people romantically think about when they think about a farm. You know, big corporations put red barns and, cattle out in green pastures, on their labels. And we are that.
In 2018, more than 9 billion chickens were raised for their meat. About 30 companies control 95% of the $31 billion industry. And they process more than 150 million chickens each week. The Hawkins Farm processes around 200 birds per week. The state of Indiana grants an exemption that allows small farmers to process their own chickens on the farm, rather than sending them off to a large poultry processor.
There are all sorts of regulations that need to be followed.
We do a citric acid dip at the end, which helps with microbial issues, and they're put into a poultry chiller, which is a very powerful refrigerator so that pathogens are not allowed to grow. And it's a very safe, clean system. And to our knowledge, there has not been one recorded case of foodborne illness from birds that have been butchered under this exemption. And this exemption's been in place for around 50 years.
Their chicken is off the chart, and we've featured them since day one of the restaurant, basically.
Pete Eshelman owns a 4-star restaurant in nearby Fort Wayne, Indiana. He also runs his own farm to support the restaurant and buys food from local farmers. In 2015, the Indiana State Legislature invited Jeff and Pete to make a presentation on farmers' markets and local restaurants.
And then I'm bragging about Hawkins, and I'm bragging about his chicken is as good as the finest chicken you buy in France. And he got up and talked about the great partnership.
Our next presenter is Jeff Hawkins from Hawkins Family Farms.
I come today as a 5th-generation Wabash County farmer. My son, who is my partner, is the 6th generation. What that means is...
they were in for a surprise.
We finished our presentation, and the chair of the committee said, well, that's illegal. So she went to the Indiana State Department of Health, and she requested that they issue a cease and desist letter.
Both the Hawkins Farm and Pete Eshelman's restaurant received the letter. They immediately had to stop selling and serving chickens from the farm.
When we first received the letter, I think it was overwhelming, and we felt very helpless.
The state attorney general soon declared it was in fact legal for the Hawkins to process chickens on their own farms. It seemed that the issue was resolved. But despite the ruling, certain senators drafted a new law in order to make it illegal.
So that's how a hashtag was born. Hashtag keep chicken on the menu. Like, you've enjoyed this meal, will you please contact your representative? People were telling us they would call and they actually would lead with, is this about the chicken thing, when they picked up the phone.
Not even hello.
Yeah.
Once again, Jeff, Zach, and Pete head to Indianapolis to testify.
They basically came up with a story that small farms processing chicken on the farms is a health risk.
2 weeks before we testified, there were 2 recalls back-to-back of something like 4 million pounds of chicken that had been inspected.
By the end of that year, over 8 million pounds of chicken had been recalled from major producers. In 2018 alone, there were 34 poultry recalls from the large producers. Remember, in over 50 years, there wasn't a single reported health issue with any small farms that were processing poultry under the exemptions.
but it didn't seem to move the needle much, and that suggested that safety wasn't fully the argument. Why was tiny little, really unusual Hawkins Farm a threat?
The opposing side was not only represented by state regulators, but also by large agricultural lobbying interests, including the Indiana Farm Bureau, the Indiana State Poultry Association, the Indiana Pork Producers Association, and the Indiana Beef and Cattle Association.
At this point, we're dead in the water. But when you uncover really what happened here, and it took a while to figure this out, it's all about eliminating competition. So if at that time, the large poultry producers, they're very well organized, they saw a small farm that was operating legally to process chickens on the farm, that's competition to them. And so how is one farm going to hurt these big producers of hundreds of thousands of birds, a year or more? It's because they don't want one farm, 2 farms, 100 farms, 500 farms, 1,000 farms. So the other thing is the value system associated with raising food locally, humane, drug-free, stress-free, you know where your food comes from, that gets people questioning a lot about what happens in industrial agriculture.
It might be a use regulation to stifle competition thing. Nobody's declared that, so draw what conclusions you will.
The social media campaign continued to create enormous public pressure. So local politicians took a closer look, without the influence of the agricultural lobbyists. Small farm owners were invited to meet with state agencies to redraft the bill.
They brought us together with the Board of Animal Health and the Department of Health and kind of said, what can we do to make this better? Is there a creative solution here?
Remarkably, a revised bill was drafted to everyone's satisfaction.
And then that bill did pass. So we're under a new kind of regulation, but one that feels appropriate to what we're trying to do here.
Right.
It went from the worst form of government to try to put somebody out of business to actually an example how government works when you have the right people in place on all sides and you're willing to listen and kind of find common ground.
We were braced for things to unfold the way they usually unfold. For the small farm to lose the battle. But because people joined in the process, people called their representatives, they shared our story online, and I think that was to the surprise of everyone involved.
Despite the efforts of large agricultural interests, the state government and local farm owners found a solution. In fact, the regulations were improved to better suit small farms while maintaining high safety standards. Now, restaurants like Pete Eshelman's can continue to serve locally sourced poultry, and neighbors have a choice in the food that they eat.
Identify you because it's not